Chapter 8. Her Grace, the Duchess. The drawing room at the Brocket estate bore witness to yet another of Mrs. Brocket's attempts to parade her daughters before potential suitors. On this particular afternoon, her target was Mr. Augustus Blackwood, a gentleman whose wealth was matched only by the peculiar gleam in his eye when observing others' discomfort. "I assure you, Mr. Blackwood, Isabella's accomplishments are most perspicuous," Mrs. Brocket declared, mangling the word's meaning, while Isabella visibly cringed behind her teacup. "Indeed!" Mr. Blackwood's lips curled into what might have been a smile had it reached his eyes. "How fascinating!" Mr. Brocket, ensconced in his armchair, lifted his gaze momentarily from his book before returning to its pages with a barely audible sigh. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Brocket continued, her voice climbing to the shrill heights it achieved whenever she sensed the proximity of advantageous matrimony. "And Marianne is equally accomplished, though in more ethereal pursuits." "I've been teaching our cat to juggle," Marianne offered brightly. "He's quite terrible at it, but his determination is inspiring." Mr. Blackwood's eyebrows ascended towards his hairline as Mrs. Brocket's face contorted into what could only be described as the expression of someone who had just swallowed a particularly argumentative wasp. "Marianne, dear," she hissed through clenched teeth, "perhaps you might fetch more tea?" "But the teapot's still full," Marianne observed, peering into it with genuine concern. "Unless the tea has learned to evaporate at will, which would be rather impressive, don't you think?" Catherine, who had been scribbling furiously in her journal, looked up with dreamy eyes. "Perhaps it's like my heart, forever emptying itself of—" "That will do, Catherine," Mrs. Brocket snapped, her fingers drumming an agitated rhythm on her armrest. Mr. Blackwood's attention, however, had shifted to the window, where Mabel could be seen dragging her broom across the garden path with all the enthusiasm of a tax collector at his own audit. "Fascinating household you maintain, Mrs. Brocket," he remarked, his tone carrying an undercurrent that made Isabella narrow her eyes suspiciously. "Mabel!" Mrs. Brocket shrieked through the window. "Do cease that infernal sweeping and attend to the drawing-room immediately." "I ain't finished the path yet, have I?" came the belligerent reply. "Unless you want me to do two things at once, which ain't natural for no living soul, if you ask me." "Nobody did ask you, Mabel," Mrs. Brocket muttered, before turning back to Mr. Blackwood with a smile that threatened to crack her face. "One simply cannot get reliable help these days. They're all so recalcitrant." She pronounced the word as if it meant delightful, causing Mr. Brocket to emit a small choking sound from behind his book. Mr. Blackwood rose suddenly, straightening his impeccable waistcoat. "Mrs. Brocket, might I have a word in private? I have a rather unusual proposition to discuss." Mrs. Brocket practically levitated from her seat in her eagerness to usher him into the adjacent room, leaving her daughters exchanging worried glances. In the library, Mr. Blackwood's demeanour shifted subtly, like a snake uncoiling. "My dear Mrs. Brocket, I shall be direct. Your daughters are charming in their way. However, before I could consider an alliance with your family, I would require proof of your commitment to accommodating a gentleman's particular tastes." Mrs. Brocket's eyes gleamed with the intensity of a hunter spotting prey. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood, we are nothing if not accommodating." "Excellent. You see, I have a particular fondness for livestock, specifically pigs." He paused, savouring her confusion. "I propose a test. Allow one of my prize pigs to reside inside your home for 1 week, treated as an honoured guest, and I shall seriously consider a match with one of your daughters." Mrs. Brocket's face performed a series of remarkable gymnastics as she processed this information. Pig?" she whispered, as if the word might summon the creature instantly. "Indeed, a charming Hampshire sow named Duchess. She's really quite refined as pigs go." His lips twitched. "Of course, if you feel this is beyond your capabilities—" "Not at all," Mrs. Brockett interjected, though her voice had risen several octaves. "We would be honoured to host your distinguished pet." As they returned to the drawing-room, Mr. Blackwood caught the eye of his friend, Mr. Pembroke, who had been waiting in his carriage outside. The two gentlemen shared a look of such calculated amusement that even the most obtuse observer would have recognised their true intentions, had Mrs. Brockett not been so thoroughly blinded by her matrimonial ambitions. "Then it's settled," Mr. Blackwood announced to the room at large. "Duchess shall arrive tomorrow morning. I trust you'll make her feel quite at home." As he took his leave, the drawing-room descended into chaos. "Mother, you cannot be serious!" Isabella exclaimed, horror etched across her features. "A pig?" Mr. Brockett inquired mildly, finally lowering his book. "How novel!" "Oh, how wonderful!" Marianne clapped her hands. "I've always wanted to teach a pig to play whist, though I suppose we'll need to modify the cards for hooves." Catherine had already begun composing an ode to porcine love in her journal, while Mabel, who had finally deigned to enter the room, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed. "I ain't cleaning up after no pig," she announced flatly. "That weren't in me terms of employment, which I'm sure of, seeing as I never signed nothing to begin with." Mrs. Brockett drew herself up to her full height, her expression settling into one of grim determination. "We shall all make sacrifices for the greater good of this family's social elevation. If entertaining a pig for 1 week is what it takes to secure a wealthy match, then that is precisely what we shall do." "I believe the pig might be doing the entertaining," Mr. Brockett murmured, but his wife was already sweeping from the room, no doubt to compose a list of rules for porcine etiquette. Meanwhile, in their carriage, Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Pembroke were enjoying the fruits of their scheme. "I must say, Blackwood," Mr. Pembroke chuckled, "you've outdone yourself this time. A pig, and she actually agreed." "My dear Pembroke, you underestimate the desperate lengths to which a mother will go in pursuit of an advantageous match. Besides," he added, his eyes glinting maliciously, "I've always found it amusing to watch pride wrestle with necessity, particularly when both are doomed to lose." The carriage rolled away from the Brockett estate, leaving behind a household teetering on the brink of what would prove to be a most remarkable week indeed. The arrival of Duchess the following morning heralded a new era in the Brockett household, one that would be remembered with equal parts horror and hysteria. "She's very substantial," Isabella observed weakly, as the enormous Hampshire sow was led into their front parlour by Mr. Blackwood's smirking footman. "Quite the distinguished creature," Mrs. Brockett declared with desperate cheerfulness, though her smile faltered as Duchess immediately began investigating the Persian rug with her snout. "Perhaps we should establish some boundaries?" The footman merely tipped his hat and departed, leaving behind a list of Duchess's preferred activities and dietary requirements that read more like the demands of a minor monarch than a pig's care instructions. "Must be addressed as Your Grace at all times," Mr. Brockett read aloud from his armchair, his voice trembling with barely suppressed mirth. "Prefers her afternoon tea served in fine china." Before Mrs. Brockett could respond, a tremendous crash from the corner announced that Duchess had discovered the Chinese vase, or rather, had reduced it to fragments while attempting to scratch her considerable bulk against the pedestal. "Your Grace!" Mrs. Brockett cried, her voice reaching previously undiscovered octaves. "We do not... that is to say... Oh, good heavens!" I believe her Grace is expressing her artistic temperament, Marianne suggested brightly, watching as the pig proceeded to redecorate the parlour through strategic demolition, though her technique does seem rather avant-garde. The next few days passed in a blur of escalating chaos. Duchess, it seemed, had decided that the drawing-room furniture would be better arranged in what Marianne termed a more naturalistic configuration, which apparently meant overturned and partially chewed. The arrival of Lady Pembroke for her weekly social call proved particularly memorable. "My dear Mrs. Brocket," Lady Pembroke began, settling onto the sofa with her customary air of superiority, "I simply had to call after hearing the most extraordinary rumours about your new house guest." She was interrupted by a distinctive snuffling sound from beneath her skirts, followed by a sharp squeal. Lady Pembroke leapt to her feet with remarkable agility for a woman of her years, just as Duchess emerged from under the sofa, proudly sporting Lady Pembroke's lace handkerchief in her mouth. "Good gracious!" Lady Pembroke clutched her chest. "Is that a... Her Grace, the Duchess?" Mrs. Brocket supplied faintly. "She's visiting from Mr. Blackwood's estate. Do have another cucumber sandwich." "I believe I shall take my leave," Lady Pembroke announced, backing toward the door as Duchess approached with what could only be described as unseemly interest in her hat feathers. The increasingly mutinous Mabel had developed her own methods of coping with their noble guest. "I don't care if she's the Queen of Sheba herself," Mabel declared, armed with a broom after finding Duchess investigating the kitchen pantry. "No one tracks more grubbiness through these floors, be they human or hog." Even Catherine's romantic sensibilities were tested when Duchess developed an unfortunate appetite for poetry, consuming 3 of her leather-bound journals before being discovered. "Perhaps she hungers for the written word," Catherine suggested tearfully, watching as Mabel attempted to rescue the sodden remains of her latest sonnets. "More likely she hungers for anything that ain't nailed down," Mabel muttered darkly. The breaking point of the day came during what Mrs. Brocket had hoped would be a dignified dinner party, arranged to demonstrate their ability to maintain social graces despite their unusual circumstances. "I must say, Mrs. Brocket," simpered Mrs. Worthington, "you're handling this situation with remarkable composure, though I can't imagine what Mr. Blackwood could be thinking." Her words were cut short by a tremendous crash from the dining-room doorway, where Duchess had apparently mastered the art of door handles. The pig proceeded to make a stately entrance, wearing what appeared to be one of Isabella's best bonnets, wrapped around its tail. "Is that my new Parisian?" Isabella began, before dissolving into horrified silence. "How innovative," declared Mr. Worthington, clearly struggling to maintain his composure. "I wasn't aware that porcine fashion had become quite so continental." The evening reached its inevitable conclusion when Duchess, perhaps feeling that the table settings were not to her exacting standards, decided to demonstrate her own ideas about furniture arrangement. The resulting chaos of overturned dishes, scattered silverware, and fleeing guests would have been almost balletic had it not been so catastrophic. As Mrs. Brocket surveyed the wreckage of her dining room later that evening, Mr. Brocket finally looked up from his newspaper. "My dear, I don't wish to state the obvious, but are you quite certain this arrangement is worth the structural modifications to our home?" "It's merely a temporary inconvenience," Mrs. Brocket insisted, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Mr. Blackwood's fortune would more than compensate for any minor adjustments required to accommodate his interests." "Minor adjustments?" Mr. Brocket raised an eyebrow at the newly renovated dining room, where Duchess was now contentedly dozing amid the ruins of their best tablecloth. "My dear, I believe we may need to reassess your definition of minor. As if in response, a distant crash echoed from the direction of the music room, followed by the discordant twang of piano strings. "That'll be Her Grace's evening concert," Marianne announced cheerfully. "She seems to prefer the lower octaves, though her technique is rather percussive." Mrs. Brockett sank into what remained of her favourite chair, her expression suggesting that she was beginning to question whether any fortune could be worth the price of porcine patronage. In the kitchen, Mabel's voice could be heard delivering a lengthy monologue on the proper behaviour expected of aristocratic livestock, punctuated by the occasional crash and grunt. "I don't care if you're the Duchess of Devonshire herself," she declared. "Them truffles was for tomorrow's dinner, and that's final." As night fell over the Brocket estate, the household settled into what had become its new normal, a state of barely contained chaos, punctuated by the occasional sound of furniture meeting its doom and Mabel's increasingly creative threats regarding the proper deportment of noble swine. Somewhere across town, in a comfortable study, Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Pembroke raised their glasses in a toast to the success of their scheme, blissfully unaware that they had perhaps underestimated the resilience of both the Brocket family and their porcine agent of chaos. "To Her Grace," Mr. Blackwood smirked, "and to the entertainment she no doubt provides." "Indeed," Mr. Pembroke replied, "though I can't help but wonder if we've created a monster." The monster in question was, at that very moment, discovering the joys of Mrs. Brocket's rose garden, proving that no aspect of the Brocket estate would be spared from her thorough investigation of its entertainment potential. By the fourth day of Duchess's residence, the Brocket household had descended into a state that teetered between farce and warfare. Mrs. Brocket's attempts to maintain order had grown increasingly desperate, while the pig's talent for chaos seemed to multiply exponentially. "I simply cannot comprehend," Mrs. Brocket announced during what remained of breakfast, "how one animal can cause such complete and utter devastation," Isabella supplied, watching as Duchess performed her morning constitutional through what had once been their conservatory. "Artistic renovation?" Marianne suggested cheerfully, sketching the pig's latest redecorating efforts in her notebook. "The word you're seeking, my dear, is catastrophe," Mr. Brocket offered from behind his newspaper fortress, "though perhaps apocalypse would be more fitting." The situation had indeed grown dire. The drawing-room now resembled a battlefield where furniture had lost a decisive war. An increasingly militant Mabel had barricaded herself into the kitchen with chairs and tables, dispensing meals through a small window she'd designated as the diplomatic channel. "We ain't surrendering another ham to that creature," Mabel had declared that morning, brandishing a ladle like a sword. "She's already eaten 3, and I'm convinced she knew exactly what they were." The family dynamics weren't faring much better. Isabella had taken to carrying a parasol at all times, using it as a shield against Duchess's enthusiastic greetings. Catherine had developed a new genre of poetry she called porcine Gothic, which she recited at length to anyone unable to escape quickly enough. Marianne, meanwhile, had appointed herself Duchess's official biographer, following the pig around with notebook in hand, recording what she called historical observations for posterity. "Look!" Marianne exclaimed, pointing through the window. "She's developed a new technique for uprooting Mother's rose bushes. The rotational force she applies with her snout is really quite innovative." Mrs. Brocket's shriek could probably be heard in the next county. The afternoon brought a new crisis when Duchess discovered the music room's acoustic properties. The pig's enthusiastic exploration of the piano's internal mechanics produced what Marianne described as an avant-garde symphony, and what everyone else called the sound of expensive things dying. "Perhaps," Mr. Brockett suggested mildly as they watched their daughter's piano being systematically dismantled. We should consider this an investment in musical education. The only investment, Mrs. Brockett hissed through clenched teeth, is the one I'm making in my future nervous breakdown. The situation reached a new peak of absurdity during that evening's attempted family dinner. Mrs. Brockett had insisted on maintaining some semblance of normalcy, despite the fact that their dining room now resembled a particularly enthusiastic reconstruction of a battlefield. "We shall simply have to adapt," she declared, setting up a makeshift table using what remained of a sideboard and several books. "Civilization must prevail." It was at this precise moment that Duchess, who had developed an uncanny sense of dramatic timing, made her entrance. She had somehow acquired one of Mrs. Brockett's best caps, which sat askew between her ears like a jaunty crown. "Mother," Isabella began carefully, "is that your new—" "We shall not discuss it," Mrs. Brockett interrupted, her eye twitching slightly. "We shall simply eat our soup and pretend this is perfectly normal." "But surely—" Catherine started. "Perfectly normal." Mrs. Brockett's voice had taken on a slightly hysterical edge. The family attempted to follow this directive, though it proved challenging when Duchess decided to join them for dinner, positioning herself at what remained of the table with an air of regal expectation. "She does have rather good posture," Marianne observed, "for a pig." "Marianne," Mrs. Brockett said with dangerous calm, "if you make one more comment about that creature's accomplishments, you shall be joining her for the night. Heaven forbid, wherever that might be." The evening deteriorated further when Duchess expressed her culinary criticism by overturning the soup tureen, creating what Marianne would later describe in her notes as a bold statement on the limitations of traditional serving vessels. Later that night, as Mrs. Brockett sat amid the ruins of her once orderly household, she began to show signs of cracking. "Perhaps," she muttered to herself, while Duchess performed her evening demolition of the hallway furniture, "perhaps spinsterhood isn't such a terrible fate after all." "Mother's developed a rather concerning habit of talking to the wallpaper," Isabella observed to her father. "To be fair to your mother," Mr. Brockett replied, "the wallpaper is currently one of the few things in this house that hasn't been redesigned by Her Grace." As if on cue, there came the sound of ripping paper from the hallway. "I stand corrected." The breaking point came the next morning when Mrs. Brockett discovered Duchess had somehow managed to access her private sitting room, her last sanctuary of order in the chaos-riddled house. The pig had apparently decided that Mrs. Brockett's collection of miniature porcelain figurines would be improved by a more abstract arrangement, specifically one that involved them being scattered across the floor in several hundred pieces. Mrs. Brockett's scream of rage brought the entire household running, only to find her standing in the doorway, her carefully maintained composure finally shattered. This is beyond bearing," she declared, gesturing wildly at the devastation before her. "I have endured the destruction of my furniture. I have accepted the loss of my china. I have even reconciled myself to the fact that my best cap is now being worn as a fashion accessory by a pig. But this is the final straw." "Mother," Marianne began soothingly, "perhaps we should look at this as an opportunity to explore new decorating styles." The look Mrs. Brockett gave her daughter could have frozen champagne in a French cellar. "I believe," Mr. Brockett suggested gently, "that your mother might benefit from some quiet time, perhaps in the garden." "The garden?" Mrs. Brockett's laugh had a slightly maniacal edge. "The garden that now resembles a battlefield. The garden where my roses have been replaced by wallows." Duchess, showing her usual impeccable timing, chose this moment to parade past the door, wearing what appeared to be the remains of Mrs. Brocket's second-best shawl. "That's it!" Mrs. Brocket announced, her voice ringing with newfound purpose. "This farce has gone on long enough. Isabella, fetch my writing desk. What remains of it? Catherine, stop composing an ode to destruction and find me a pen that her Grace hasn't eaten. Marianne, just stop taking notes." "But, Mother," Marianne protested, "I'm just reaching the climactic chapter of A Pig's Progress, a study in social elevation." Mrs. Brocket's only response was a sound that suggested she was seriously reconsidering her stance on having children at all. As she sat down to compose what promised to be an explosive letter to Mr. Blackwood, Duchess could be heard in the distance, apparently attempting to redesign the kitchen garden with the help of several displaced cabbages. "I believe," Mr. Brocket remarked to no one in particular, "that we are about to witness what happens when an immovable force of social ambition meets an irresistible agent of chaos." "That's rather poetic, Father," Catherine observed, already scribbling in her notebook, "though perhaps with more porcine imagery." "Catherine," Mrs. Brocket said, without looking up from her furious writing, "if you compose one more pig-themed poem, you shall be joining Marianne with the pig tonight." And so, as the sun set on another day of porcine pandemonium, the stage was set for what promised to be a spectacular conclusion to the great pig experiment. In the kitchen, Mabel could be heard delivering what had become her nightly sermon on proper aristocratic behaviour to an unrepentant Duchess. "And another thing," her voice echoed through the chaos-strewn halls. "Real duchesses don't eat the furniture. It ain't dignified." The final confrontation occurred on a Thursday afternoon, Mrs. Brocket having woken that morning to find Duchess had somehow infiltrated her own bedchamber and announced her presence with a thunderous porcine expulsion beside her on the mattress. "Good heavens!" Mrs. Brocket had shrieked, leaping from her bed. "Even in my own chambers is nothing sacred." Duchess had merely grunted contentedly in response, settling into the goose-down pillows. The breaking point came precisely 1 hour after the pig had discovered the joy of sliding down the main staircase using Mrs. Brocket's best tablecloth as a makeshift sled. "The carriage is ready, Mother," Isabella announced, watching as Mrs. Brocket adjusted her hat with military precision. "Excellent." Mrs. Brocket's voice had the calm of a gathering storm. "Marianne, kindly stop teaching that creature to waltz and help your sister secure the house." "But, Mother, she's just mastered the basic step." "Now, Marianne." The drive to Mr. Blackwood's estate was spent in ominous silence, broken only by Mrs. Brocket's occasional muttering about aristocratic livestock and criminal destruction of property. They found Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Pembroke enjoying tea in the garden, looking altogether too pleased with themselves. "Ah, Mrs. Brocket!" Mr. Blackwood's smile had all the warmth of a winter frost. "How delightful! And how is our dear Duchess adapting to—" "Mr. Blackwood," Mrs. Brocket cut in, her voice sharp enough to slice steel, "I believe we need to discuss the terms of our arrangement." "Oh?" His eyebrows rose with practised innocence. "Has something displeased you?" Mrs. Brocket's laugh had the brittle edge of breaking glass. "Displeased me? Allow me to elaborate, sir, on exactly what has displeased me." What followed was a masterclass in controlled fury. Mrs. Brocket, drawing herself up to her full height, proceeded to deliver an itemized list of grievances with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor. "Your distinguished guest has reduced my drawing-room to kindling, converted my conservatory into what I can only describe as a swamp, and appears to believe that my best china makes excellent percussion instruments." Mr. Blackwood tried his best to stifle a laugh. "Furthermore," she continued, building momentum like an avalanche, "she has developed a taste for literature that has cost my daughter 3 journals of poetry." "Thank heavens for small mercies," Mr. Pembroke muttered, earning himself a glare that nearly set his cravat ablaze. "Destroyed 2 centuries of carefully cultivated roses, and seems to believe that my wardrobe is her personal costume collection." "My dear Mrs. Brockett," Mr. Blackwood attempted to interject. "I am not finished, sir." Her voice crackled like ice breaking on a frozen pond. "Do you know what I realized this morning as I watched your noble pig converting my last intact sofa into bedding? I realized that no fortune, no social elevation, no advantageous match is worth the systematic destruction of one's dignity." Mr. Blackwood's amusement showed signs of transitioning to impatience. "You, sir," Mrs. Brockett declared, jabbing a finger in his direction, "are nothing but a common bully, amusing yourself with the desperation of others. Well, I shall tell you something, Mr. Blackwood. I would rather see all my daughters marry chimney sweeps than align my family with someone of such questionable character. Now, see here." Mr. Blackwood started to rise, but Mrs. Brockett was beyond stopping. "No, you see here, your pig will be returned to you forthwith, along with what remains of my best cap, which she seems to have grown rather attached to. And you, sir, can take your fortune, your refined livestock, and your matrimonial prospects, and feed them to your next unsuspecting victim." The silence that followed this declaration was absolute. Even the garden birds seemed to have paused their singing in appreciation of Mrs. Brockett's performance. Mr. Pembroke was the first to break, a snort of laughter escaping before he could contain it. This proved to be a mistake. Mrs. Brockett turned on him with the speed of a striking cobra. "And you, sir, don't think I haven't noticed your role in this farce, sitting there like a well-fed cat, enjoying the spectacle of other people's misfortune. You're no better than he is." Both gentlemen now had the distinct look of schoolboys caught in mischief by a particularly fearsome headmistress. "I trust," Mrs. Brockett concluded, her voice dripping with Arctic politeness, "that you will send someone to collect your Duchess within the hour. Though I should warn you, she's developed rather strong opinions about interior decoration. I do hope your drawing-room furniture is adequately insured." With that, she turned on her heel and swept toward the carriage, leaving behind 2 thoroughly chastened gentlemen and several servants who were trying very hard to pretend they hadn't been listening at the windows. "Well," Mr. Pembroke said finally, "that was rather more exciting than our usual Thursday afternoon tea." Mr. Blackwood, looking slightly perturbed, merely grunted in response. Back at the Brockett estate, the family gathered to witness Duchess's departure. The pig was escorted out with all the ceremony of a deposed monarch, still wearing Mrs. Brockett's cap at a rakish angle. "Goodbye, Your Grace," Marianne sniffled, having grown genuinely attached to their chaos-causing guest. "The house will be so dull without you." "Marianne," Mrs. Brockett said wearily, "if you start crying over that creature's departure, I shall have to seriously reconsider your upbringing." As Duchess was loaded into Mr. Blackwood's cart, a process that involved significant negotiation and half a ham, the Brockett family surveyed the wreckage of their home. "Well," Mr. Brockett observed mildly, "I suppose we can now begin the process of reconstruction." "Indeed," Mrs. Brockett agreed, her voice firm. "And our first order of business shall be to establish a new rule. No livestock shall ever again be admitted to this house regardless of their social status or breeding." "A wise policy," Mr. Brockett nodded. "And as for your handling of Mr. Blackwood, I haven't seen such a display of righteous fury since your grandmother caught the vicar stealing her plums." Mrs. Brocket allowed herself a small smile. "Yes. Well, there comes a point when one must decide between social advancement and self-respect. Though I must admit, the decision became considerably easier after I found Her Grace using my best bonnet as a feeding trough." As the family began the monumental task of restoring order to their home, Mabel could be heard in the kitchen, delivering what she clearly intended to be her final word on the matter. "Good riddance to grand relations, I say, though I'll miss having someone who actually listened to me lectures on proper behaviour. That pig was a better listener than most of the quality I've met." And so ended the great pig experiment, leaving behind a household somewhat battered. Mrs. Brocket would later reflect that while the week had cost her a fortune in furniture and china, it had bought her something far more valuable: the realization that dignity, once surrendered, was far harder to restore than a rose garden. As for Mr. Blackwood and Mr. Pembroke, they were last seen hastily revising their entertainment plans, having learned that some forms of amusement can backfire spectacularly, especially when served deftly by a maid who unleashed 36 ravenous rats inside their home one midnight. And Duchess? She never quite forgot her brief taste of high society, as evidenced by her stubborn refusal to relinquish Mrs. Brocket's cap, which she continued to wear until it finally disintegrated some months later.